The youngest working professional at the Family Feud studio was 4 years old, and she was exhausted. Emma Johnson clutched her sparkly pink backpack with one hand and her manager's business card with the other, moving through the bright corridors with the practiced confidence of someone who'd been navigating Hollywood since she could walk. At 4 years and 8 months old, Emma had already appeared in 12 television commercials, 2 music videos, and a national campaign for a breakfast cereal that had made her face recognizable to millions of American families. Standing in the Family Feud waiting area, Emma looked like any other preschooler. Blonde pigtails tied with purple ribbons, a carefully coordinated outfit that photographed well under studio lights, and the kind of bright smile that casting directors called money in the bank. But there was something in her eyes, a weariness that seemed too mature for her age, that suggested this little girl had been working when she should have been playing. The Johnson family had driven from their modest apartment in Burbank to the Family Feud studios, but this wasn't a vacation or a fun family outing. For Emma's parents, Michelle and David Johnson, this appearance represented potential exposure that could lead to more bookings, more commercial work, more opportunities to capitalize on Emma's natural charisma and camera-friendly personality. Michelle Johnson carried a bag filled with Emma's headshots, touch-up makeup, and energy drinks, designed to keep her daughter alert through long filming days. David handled the paperwork and contracts, managing Emma's career with the kind of intensity usually reserved for adult entertainers. They weren't stage parents in the traditional sense. They genuinely loved their daughter. But economic desperation had led them to see Emma's natural charm as their family's ticket to financial stability. Emma had been discovered at a grocery store when she was 2.5, her natural effervescence catching the attention of a talent scout who gave Michelle a business card and promised that Emma had the look. What started as occasional modeling jobs had quickly escalated into a full schedule of auditions, callbacks, and bookings that filled Emma's days with work instead of the typical activities of a 4-year-old. By age 3, Emma was earning more money than either of her parents, supporting a household that had come to depend on her income. She'd learned to smile on command, to hit her marks during filming, to take direction from adults who saw her as a product rather than a person. And while she was too young to understand the full scope of what was happening to her childhood, she had internalized the message that her value was tied to her performance, her ability to make other people happy and successful. The Family Feud producers had been thrilled when the Johnson family applied. Emma's recognizable face would bring additional viewers, and her presence would add a unique dynamic to the show. What they didn't realize was that Emma approached this appearance the same way she approached every professional obligation, with the kind of focused determination that should never be asked of someone who still needed nap time. Standing in the Family Feud studio during rehearsal, Emma displayed the professional composure that had made her successful in commercial work. She listened carefully to directions, positioned herself correctly at the family podium, and responded to Steve Harvey's interactions with the practiced charm that casting directors had trained her to deploy. Steve Harvey approached the Johnson family during the pre-show introductions with his characteristic warmth. But something about Emma immediately caught his attention. In his decades of hosting, Steve had developed an instinct for reading people. And there was something about this 4-year-old that didn't quite fit the usual pattern of excited children appearing on television with their families. "Well, hello there, beautiful," Steve said, kneeling down to Emma's level with the genuine affection he showed all the children who appeared on his show. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "I'm Emma Johnson," she replied with perfect articulation and direct eye contact, her response delivered with the kind of professional polish that most adults struggled to achieve. "I'm 4 years old, and I'm an actor." Steve's eyebrows raised slightly. Most 4-year-olds introduce themselves with shy giggles or excited babbling about their favorite toys. But Emma spoke like someone who'd been media trained, someone who understood that every interaction was a potential audition. "An actor?" Steve asked, his voice gentle but curious. "That's pretty impressive for someone who's 4. What kind of acting do you do?" "Commercials mostly," Emma said matter-of-factly. "And some music videos. My manager says I have good camera presence and that I'm very professional for my age." Something about the way Emma used words like camera presence and professional, terms that no 4-year-old should know, let alone deploy with such confidence, made Steve pause. He looked at Emma's parents, then back at this remarkably composed little girl, and began to sense that there was more to this story than a typical family appearing on his show. The game began with the usual Family Feud energy, but Emma's participation stood out in ways that were both impressive and unsettling. When it was her turn to buzz in, she did so with the timing and confidence of someone who understood television production. Her answers were articulate and strategic, delivered with the kind of camera-aware performance that suggested extensive experience in front of audiences. The Johnson family was playing against the Martinez family from Phoenix, and the competition was spirited. Emma's contributions to her family's success were significant. Her answers consistently landed on the board, and her interactions with Steve generated the kind of positive audience response that made for good television. But Steve, watching her carefully, noticed details that troubled him. Emma never broke character. Even during commercial breaks, when most children would relax and act their age, Emma maintained her professional demeanor. She didn't run around or ask for snacks or display any of the spontaneous behavior typical of preschoolers. Instead, she stood quietly, occasionally checking with her parents to make sure she was performing correctly. During one commercial break, Steve watched Emma's mother touch up her daughter's makeup and whisper last-minute instructions about maintaining her smile and speaking clearly. It was the kind of coaching he'd seen with adult performers, not something he'd ever witnessed between a parent and a 4-year-old child. By the fourth round of the game, subtle signs of Emma's exhaustion were beginning to show despite her professional training. Her smile, while still bright, required more effort to maintain. Her posture was perfect, but Steve noticed that she occasionally swayed slightly, the way very young children do when they're fighting fatigue. The game had been progressing for over an hour, including rehearsal time, and while the adult contestants remained energized by the competitive atmosphere, Emma was operating on a level of professional discipline that seemed impossible for someone her age. She continued to perform flawlessly, but Steve's trained eye caught the micro-expressions of tiredness that she was working hard to conceal. Emma's parents watched from the family podium with intense focus, not the relaxed enjoyment that most families displayed during their Family Feud experience. They monitored Emma's every move, ready to intervene if her performance faltered, treating this game show appearance like any other professional booking that required careful management of their daughter's energy and presentation. The studio audience had been charmed by Emma throughout the game, responding enthusiastically to her articulate answers and confident demeanor. But Steve found himself increasingly troubled by what he was witnessing. This wasn't a 4-year-old having fun on television. This was a 4-year-old working, and the distinction was becoming more apparent with each passing minute. The question that changed everything seemed innocent enough, the kind of prompt that usually generated sweet, age-appropriate responses from young contestants that delighted audiences and made for heartwarming television moments. "We asked 100 people," Steve announced with his signature enthusiasm. "What is your favorite thing to do?" It was Emma's turn at the podium. She stepped forward with the practice confidence she'd displayed throughout the game, positioning herself correctly for the cameras with movements that seemed too calculated for someone who still qualified for preschool. Her parents watched with the intense attention they'd maintained throughout the taping, ready to offer subtle cues if necessary. Steve repeated the question with his warm, encouraging tone. "Emma, what is your favorite thing to do?" For the first time since the cameras had started rolling, Emma hesitated. Not the brief pause of someone thinking through survey answers, but a longer moment that suggested internal conflict. Her professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something more vulnerable underneath the polished performance she'd been maintaining. When Emma finally spoke, her voice was smaller than it had been throughout the game, more like the voice of an actual 4-year-old than the confident performer who'd been charming audiences all afternoon. "Working," Emma said quietly. "I like working because it makes my mommy and daddy happy, and when they're happy, I get to stay." The words hit the studio like a physical force. Emma's answer wasn't just unexpected. It was devastating, because buried in those innocent words was a 4-year-old's understanding that her value, her security, her place in her family was conditional on her ability to generate income and please adults through her performance. The studio audience fell silent as they processed what they'd just heard. Steve's smile faded completely as the full implication of Emma's response settled over him. This wasn't a child expressing genuine preference for work over play. This was a 4-year-old who had been conditioned to believe that her worth was tied to her productivity, that love and security were rewards for successful performance, rather than unconditional family bonds. Steve Harvey had hosted thousands of hours of television, had navigated every conceivable situation that could arise during game show production, but he found himself in completely uncharted territory. Standing on his stage, looking at this 4-year-old who had just articulated a worldview that no child should possess, Steve felt something crack inside his professional composure. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Steve set his cards down, not placed them carefully, but dropped them as he walked away from his podium toward Emma. His movement was deliberate and urgent, like someone responding to an emergency that only he could see. The cameras continued rolling, but everyone in the studio understood that they were no longer watching a game show. They were witnessing something more important and more troubling. "Stop the music," Steve called out, his voice carrying a new authority that immediately silenced the production. "Stop everything." The familiar Family Feud theme cut out abruptly, leaving the studio in the kind of silence that felt heavy with significance. Steve reached Emma and knelt down in front of her, his attention completely focused on this little girl who had just revealed something that changed everything. "Emma," Steve said softly, his voice stripped of all performance and entertainment value, "can you tell me what you mean when you say you like working?" Emma looked at Steve with eyes that seemed too knowing for her age, as if she understood that something important was happening but wasn't sure what it was. "I go to auditions and filming and photo shoots," Emma explained with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a routine. "And when I do a good job, my parents are proud of me, and we have money for groceries and rent. And when I don't get picked for jobs, they get sad and worried, and sometimes they fight." Steve's jaw tightened as he processed what Emma was telling him. At 4 years old, this little girl understood that her family's financial stability and emotional harmony depended on her ability to successfully compete in an adult industry, to perform on demand, to sacrifice her childhood for economic necessity. "Emma," Steve asked gently, "what do you like to do when you're not working?" Emma's expression became confused, as if the question didn't make sense to her. "I don't not work," she said simply. "When I'm not at auditions, I'm practicing or learning lines or doing photo shoots. My manager says I have to stay ready for opportunities." Steve Harvey stood up slowly, and everyone in the studio could see that something fundamental had changed in his demeanor. He was no longer a game show host, managing an awkward moment. He was a man who had just encountered something that offended his deepest beliefs about how children should be treated, how families should function, how innocence should be protected. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve announced, his voice carrying a gravity that made everyone in the studio sit up straighter, "we have a problem here, and we're going to address it right now." Steve began removing his suit jacket, the gesture that had become his signature in moments when entertainment gave way to humanity. But this time, the symbolism felt different, more urgent. This wasn't just comfort for a struggling contestant. This was protection for a child who needed advocates she didn't even know she was missing. "Emma," Steve said, wrapping his jacket around her tiny shoulders where it hung like a protective cloak, "I want you to know something very important. 4-year-olds don't work. 4-year-olds play. They color and sing songs and make messes and take naps and learn to ride bicycles. They don't support families. They don't worry about rent money. They don't perform for their security." Steve turned to address Emma's parents directly, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for argument. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, I need you to understand something. This little girl just told us that she believes her value in your family is conditional on her ability to generate income. That's not acceptable. That's not what families are supposed to be." The studio fell completely silent as Steve's words settled over everyone present. The audience, the crew, even the competing family recognized that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that transcended entertainment and entered the realm of child advocacy. Steve knelt back down to Emma's level, his voice becoming gentle again, but no less determined. "Emma, sweetie, I want to teach you some new words. The first word is play. Can you say that?" "Play," Emma repeated, though she said it like she was learning a foreign language. "That's right. And playing means doing things just because they're fun, not because someone is watching or because you might get paid. It means being silly and making mistakes and not worrying about being perfect. Steve stood up again and made an announcement that would define this moment and everything that followed. "This game is over," he declared. "Not because anyone lost, but because we just learned that a 4-year-old is carrying burdens that belong to adults. And that ends today." Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, making a call right there on stage in front of everyone. "Sarah, it's Steve Harvey. I need you to connect me with the best child advocacy attorney you know. Right now, because I've got a situation that needs immediate attention." While Steve was on the phone, something beautiful happened in the studio. The audience began applauding, not the polite television applause of entertainment, but the kind of sustained, emotional recognition that comes when people witness someone in power using that power to protect someone vulnerable. But the most significant change was in Emma herself. Wearing Steve's oversized jacket, surrounded by adults who were suddenly focused on protecting rather than exploiting her talent, she began to relax in a way that suggested she hadn't felt truly safe in a very long time. When Steve finished his call, he had one more thing to say. "Emma, I'm going to make sure you get to learn what it feels like to be 4 years old. You're going to get to play and make friends and do all the things that children are supposed to do. And your mommy and daddy are going to learn how to take care of their family without asking you to carry that responsibility." 6 months later, Steve Harvey received a video message that made him stop everything he was doing. It was Emma, now 5 years old, playing in a sandbox at a regular playground, her hair messy, her clothes dirty, laughing with the kind of unguarded joy that children display when they're simply being children. "Hi, Steve," Emma said into the camera, and her voice was different now. Higher, sillier, more appropriate for her age. "I learned how to play. I can build sandcastles and swing really high, and I made friends who don't know I was on TV. Thank you for teaching me that I don't have to work to be loved." The video had been sent by Emma's new guardians, a family friend who had stepped in when Child Protective Services intervened. Emma's parents were receiving counseling and support to learn healthier ways to manage their family's financial struggles without exploiting their daughter's childhood. The episode, when it aired, became more than television. It became a catalyst for conversations about child performers, economic desperation, and the responsibility adults have to protect childhood innocence. Steve received thousands of messages from viewers sharing their own experiences with premature responsibility, economic pressure, and the complex dynamics of families in crisis. But the most important change was in Emma herself, who had learned that love wasn't conditional on performance, that security didn't require sacrifice of innocence, and that childhood was something worth protecting even when adults forgot its value. Steve Harvey had made people laugh for decades, had hosted countless shows and met thousands of contestants. But he would always say that 4-year-old Emma Johnson taught him the most important lesson of his career. That sometimes the most powerful thing an adult can do is simply refuse to let a child sacrifice their childhood, no matter how pressing the circumstances seem to be. Because that's what happens when a 4-year-old reminds an entire television studio that work should never be a child's favorite thing, play should be, and sometimes it takes a game show host to remember that protecting that distinction is more important than any entertainment value it might sacrifice. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten, because sometimes the most important answer isn't on the board. It's in recognizing when the game itself has gone too far.